I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Nobody expected Princess Anne to be the person who shattered the silence. But inside a formal gathering of senior royals and trusted household figures, she pushed back her chair, looked directly across the room at Meghan, and delivered an accusation so specific that conversation simply died. Anne was not questioning a rumor. She was exposing what she believed was a coordinated effort to obtain private royal correspondence, influence former palace employees, and weaponize the material against the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the meeting had been called to stop a private dispute from becoming a public disaster. Around him sat Prince William, Catherine, Princess Anne, Prince Harry, Meghan, and senior household figures. The royal court, in this dramatized account, means the tightly controlled circle handling the family's most sensitive internal matters. Everyone understood the stakes. One leak could deepen a painful divide, while one false accusation could destroy what trust remained. Anne did not soften the charge. She said intermediaries connected to Meghan had approached former palace employees for archived correspondence and private recollections tied to earlier Sussex disputes, allegedly seeking material that could be assembled into a case against senior royals. Meghan stiffened, disbelief turning into anger. Harry turned toward his wife, searching her face instead of challenging his aunt, and that hesitation changed the room. Charles lowered his eyes and placed his pen on the table. The king said nothing, but Anne saw the gesture, and William saw it too. Family tensions had been dismissed as fallout, but this was different because private correspondence could affect reputations, legal exposure, and the monarchy's credibility. The future king remained silent, watching his father treat the allegation as something requiring proof rather than reassurance. Anne then produced what she described as a documented chronology of contacts. Several former staff members, she said, had been approached within the same narrow period and questioned about private communications involving past clashes with the Sussexes. One former aide's account was more troubling. The request was not merely for memories, but for copies of old messages and exchanges never intended for public release. Meghan pushed back, insisting the princess had misunderstood what happened and why those contacts were made. Harry did not immediately defend her. He looked at her, then at the chronology, and asked the question that turned suspicion into something far more personal. "Did you know they were asking for the messages?" Meghan hesitated, and in that silence, the room stopped wondering whether Anne had uncovered a misunderstanding and began wondering how deep the operation actually went. The accusation was explosive, but the real damage appeared in something much quieter: Harry's face. For years, he had defended Meghan when palace suspicion hardened around her. This time, however, he did not immediately challenge Anne. He watched his wife, listened to the details, and seemed to realize that the question was no longer whether the monarchy trusted Meghan. The question was whether he himself understood everything that had been happening around him. Harry reached for a glass of water, stopped halfway, then left it untouched as Meghan finished speaking. His position had always been painful, but now it felt almost impossible. He was caught between his marriage and the damaged bond he still carried with Charles and William, and any secret attempt to approach former palace staff would cut directly into both wounds. The old family conflict was no longer abstract. It was sitting between them, demanding an answer. Anne held her ground because, to her, discretion had never been optional. For decades, she had treated institutional duty as a hard line. Private royal communications stayed private, and loyalty meant protecting the family even when relationships were strained. That history made the suggestion that former employees had been approached for sensitive material, especially provocative. Meghan, however, refused to accept the accusation as proof of wrongdoing, and the princess refused to treat the pattern as coincidence. Harry finally asked the question himself. Had she authorized anyone to contact former palace staff? Meghan answered carefully, saying people had been trying to understand the historical record because years of conflicting accounts had left them vulnerable. She argued that gathering information was not the same as preparing an attack. The Duke listened, but his expression did not soften. For perhaps the first time, reassurance was not enough. William watched his brother without interrupting. The prince wanted clear answers, yet seeing Harry visibly shaken stirred something older than resentment, the instinct to protect the sibling he had once stood beside through grief and pressure. That instinct did not erase suspicion, but it complicated it. He could be angry with his brother and still recognize the cost of what was happening to him. Catherine then noticed something in Anne's documented timeline that changed the stakes again. One former employee listed among the contacts had once worked close enough to William and Harry to possess emotionally sensitive family communications. Those were not ordinary recollections. They could contain private exchanges tied to grief, loyalty, arguments, and moments never meant to leave the family. Meghan pushed back harder. She insisted that seeking background information did not prove an organized campaign. Anne answered that the timing, repeated approaches, and specific wording suggested coordination rather than curiosity. The room tightened again. Charles finally broke his silence and asked where the chain of contacts had begun. Anne answered without hesitation. Several months earlier, she said, everything traced back to one private royal event. And to understand why she was prepared to confront Meghan so brutally, the family now had to return to the moment when suspicion first became something far more dangerous. Months before Anne stood before the royal court, there had been one evening everyone initially dismissed as uncomfortable but insignificant. It happened after a private reception at Windsor, when a former member of palace staff received an unexpected message asking about correspondence from the turbulent period surrounding Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life. The request seemed harmless enough at first. Then came a second request. Then another. By morning, Anne had learned something that transformed unease into suspicion. Old wounds had already made those records dangerous. Harry and Meghan's departure had left behind disputed memories of meetings, briefings, private conversations, and decisions that different people remembered very differently. Former aides mattered because some had not only witnessed those moments, but retained archived correspondence, stored professional messages, preserved from past palace work that could reveal fragments of conversations never meant for public argument. Anne understood that one message, removed from context, could reopen years of bitterness. A former communications aide contacted Anne's office after the Windsor reception with a troubling account. Someone had asked the aide to locate copies of messages connected to a closed-door disagreement between William and Harry during the Sussex transition. The request felt unusually precise. It did not ask what the former employee remembered generally. It pointed toward one of the most painful clashes between the brothers, and asked whether written exchanges still existed. Anne carried that concern directly to Charles. She told the king that somebody appeared to be rebuilding the family's most painful period, piece by piece. He resisted the conclusion, not because he dismissed her instincts, but because he feared what another confrontation could do to Harry. The monarch had already watched distance harden into estrangement, and he did not want suspicion to become another irreversible fracture. Charles asked her to wait for stronger evidence. Anne agreed, reluctantly, but the delay frustrated her. She believed that if sensitive correspondence began moving between private hands, control could disappear almost instantly. Then another former employee reported a strikingly similar approach, this time involving past disagreements between Catherine and Meghan. The pattern was becoming harder to explain away. Anne studied the contacts and saw something deeply unsettling. The requests repeatedly touched the relationships most capable of causing maximum emotional and reputational damage: brother against brother, wife against wife, household against household. Whoever was asking the questions seemed less interested in history than in pressure points. Anne placed the growing contact timeline on Charles's desk. He read the first page, closed the folder, and said quietly, "Not Harry. Not again." But the princess had already reached a harsher conclusion. The trail was now moving toward an intermediary whose communications connected directly to Meghan's circle. And this was no longer about protecting Harry from another family war. It was about determining who had prepared for one. Back inside the royal court meeting, months of restraint finally collapse into direct confrontation. Anne does not raise her voice. She does something more unsettling. She becomes calmer. Meghan challenges the interpretation of the evidence, insisting there was never a secret campaign against the family. Then Anne slides one final record across the table and asks why a former palace employee was specifically told to preserve communications involving William, Catherine, and Charles. Meghan's expression changes instantly. Charles lets the confrontation continue because stopping it now would solve nothing. The royal court, in this dramatized account, is the restricted family and household gathering used to deal with sensitive internal disputes before they become public crises. Everyone now understands the Windsor trigger and the contact pattern Anne has traced across several months. If the king ends the exchange too early, Harry leaves with unanswered questions, while William and Catherine leave with deeper suspicion. Silence would no longer preserve peace. It would protect uncertainty. Meghan pushes back hard. She accuses Anne of turning an attempt to document her own experience into proof of betrayal, arguing that years of competing palace accounts left her feeling she needed records instead of memories. She says recollections had been challenged before, and that keeping a factual history was self-protection. The princess does not interrupt. She listens until Meghan finishes, then answers with the same controlled force. Anne says self-protection has a boundary. In her view, that boundary is crossed when other people's private correspondence becomes something to collect, preserve, and possibly use later. Her anger is no longer just about royal protocol. She believes family vulnerability itself has been treated as material pain, converted into leverage, arguments turned into archives, trust transformed into something that could be stored for a future confrontation. Anne pushes the final page toward Meghan. She reaches for it, reads 2 lines, then leaves her hand motionless beside the paper. According to the documented account Anne presents, one intermediary described the goal as building a complete record that could be deployed if relations with the palace deteriorated again. The word changes the atmosphere immediately. Meghan denies ever instructing anyone to use deployed. She insists that if an intermediary described the effort that way, then someone may have gone beyond what she authorized. That answer does not clear her. It creates a new problem. Harry finally interrupts both women. He no longer wants arguments about motives, loyalty, or interpretation. He wants one distinction. What did you personally authorize, and what did other people do in your name? That question changes the battle completely, because proving that a network existed is one thing, deciding who truly controlled it is another. For most of the confrontation, Charles had listened like a father trapped inside the responsibilities of a monarch. Then something shifted. He straightened the papers before him, looked first at Harry and then at Meghan, and announced that personal grievance could no longer be allowed to overlap with confidential royal material. It was not a punishment. Not yet. But the king was drawing a boundary, and everyone understood that crossing it would carry consequences. Charles knew the distinction now mattered more than ever. Private family memories belonged to the people who lived them, but correspondence created or retained through royal offices could form part of the institution's official records. As monarch, he could restrict household access, order internal reviews, and decide how sensitive communications under his authority were protected. That power did not erase the family crisis. It made the crisis harder, because every emotional wound now carried an institutional consequence. Charles turned directly to Harry. He said he would not treat his son as an enemy, no matter how bitter the past had become. But he could not ignore evidence, simply because examining it might reopen the fracture between them. The king's voice carried no triumph, only fatigue. He was trying to hold 2 truths at once. Harry was still his son, and the crown could not allow private pain to become a reason for bypassing official protections. Harry reacted sharply. He said years of conflict had taught him that every personal disagreement eventually seemed to become a palace process, a briefing, or an institutional judgment against him. Yet even he could not dismiss what had surfaced. He admitted he wanted a complete answer about who had contacted former staff, what they had asked for, and whether those requests had gone further than he understood. Charles removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at him again. "I am asking for the truth, not your surrender." Then the king made his first concrete move. He ordered that no former royal employee provide archived official material through informal channels while the source, purpose, and destination of the requests were reviewed. The restriction was narrow, but the message was unmistakable. Until the chain was understood, private access routes were closing. William then asked the question no one had fully considered. What if someone still inside the palace had helped? Anne immediately returned to the timeline. One unexplained internal contact had never fit the pattern, and now its importance became impossible to ignore. If that person had supplied names, records, or access, then the inquiry was no longer confined to Meghan's circle. The entire balance of suspicion shifted. And just as the royal court appeared ready to close ranks around Meghan, one unexplained palace contact threatened to expose an even more uncomfortable betrayal from within. The meeting ends, but the confrontation follows Harry through the corridor. Away from Anne's accusation and Charles's authority, one detail keeps repeating in his mind. The request for archived. He had known Meghan wanted former staff to speak about their experiences. He had not understood that anyone was trying to obtain copies of communications. When he finally asks her exactly how much she knew, the answer does not destroy their marriage, but it changes the emotional ground beneath them. Harry had always understood that Meghan's team wanted to speak with people who knew what happened during their royal years. To him, that meant recollections, interviews, and accounts that might defend their version of events when old disputes resurfaced. Archived correspondence was different. Those were stored messages and official exchanges preserved from earlier palace work, and obtaining them raised far more serious questions about privacy, access, and intent. Meghan begins to answer, stops, and sits down. Harry remains standing across the room, arms folded, unable to hide how deeply the omission has affected him. He asks why she never explained how extensive the outreach had become. She tells him he was already exhausted by conflict with Charles, William, and the wider family, and she feared that every defensive step would become another argument inside their marriage. Harry does not accept that explanation easily. He tells Meghan that keeping him away from the details has left him exposed. When Anne confronted them with names, dates, and requests, he could defend neither his wife nor himself because he did not know what had actually been authorized. The pain is not only about the correspondence. It is about discovering that someone he trusted made a decision about what he was strong enough to know. Meghan insists on one distinction. She says she authorized efforts to understand what records still existed, but she never ordered anyone to obtain material improperly or build an attack dossier. Her argument is clear. Identifying records is not the same as secretly collecting them. Harry hears the difference, but he also understands why Anne does not consider it enough. Harry then sends Charles a blunt message. "I knew she wanted people to speak. I did not know about collecting correspondence." Inside the palace, that statement fractures a major assumption. The king can no longer treat his son's involvement as automatically identical to Meghan's, while Anne's timeline suddenly requires a more careful reading. William reads the message twice. The prince realizes the scandal now contains two separate questions: what Meghan actually intended, and whether someone inside the palace helped push the operation further than even Harry understood. Harry's admission does not clear Meghan, but it does something Anne never expected. It forces William to reconsider whether the entire scandal has been aimed in the wrong direction. After hours of accusation, something unexpected happens. William becomes less certain. Not about the contacts they happened, not about the danger they were real, but about the assumption that every part of the operation originated with Meghan. Alone with Harry for the first time since the confrontation began, the brothers strip away advisors, spouses, courtiers, and years of accumulated grievance. What remains is painfully simple: two men trying to determine where truth ends and resentment begins. William begins with the distinction everyone had blurred. Asking someone to describe an event is not the same as requesting confidential correspondence, and receiving information is not automatically the same as knowingly obtaining protected material. That difference matters because intent changes everything. Harry agrees, and both brothers recognize something even harder. Years of conflict have trained the family to expect the worst whenever Meghan becomes connected to another palace dispute. Harry admits she kept details from him. He does not defend that choice, and he does not pretend the omission meant nothing. But he insists that secrecy inside their marriage is not automatic proof of a coordinated attack against the monarchy. William listens rather than interrupting, and that alone changes the temperature between them. For once, neither brother is arguing about who suffered more. They are testing facts. William then says something he had avoided admitting. Meghan dominated his suspicion because history made that conclusion emotionally easy. Past arguments, public accusations, fractured trust, and years of resentment had created a shortcut in his mind. If her name appeared near a controversy, he expected intention before evidence. Saying it aloud unsettles him, but it also frees the conversation from something neither brother had fully acknowledged. Harry watches the shift carefully. He reminds William of a former household figure who had repeatedly offered to help establish the record during earlier disputes. At the time, the phrase sounded like reassurance. Now it feels different. If that person had access to internal material, then the bridge between outside information gathering and confidential palace records may have existed long before Meghan understood its full reach. William returns to the unexplained internal contact. Someone inside the institution may have supplied access, encouraged requests, or deliberately allowed information to move outward while knowing suspicion would eventually fall on Meghan. The possibility is disturbing because it would mean the palace had spent hours judging an external threat while an internal participant remained hidden. With no aides present, William quietly slides Harry's phone back across the table after rereading the message to Charles and says, "Then we separate what you knew from what happened." William returns to the king with a new position. Meghan must answer for what she authorized, but the palace must expose its own participant before delivering judgment. For the first time since Anne stood up in that room, the palace is no longer hunting a single villain, and that shift completely changes the verdict. By morning, privacy is gone. Details of Anne's confrontation have escaped the walls that were supposed to contain them, and Britain wakes to a royal dispute stripped of diplomatic language. The argument is no longer confined to Charles's table or Harry's marriage. Newspapers, broadcasters, commentators, and crowds begin choosing sides. Yet beneath the loudest accusations, one new fact starts changing the public conversation. Investigators are now examining assistance that came from inside the palace itself. Charles understands immediately that the leak has transformed a controlled family inquiry into an international crisis. The palace is forced to acknowledge that questions surrounding private communications are under review, even while refusing to declare guilt before the facts are separated. That distinction matters because public opinion is already hardening. Some believe Anne protected royal privacy exactly as duty required. Others argue Meghan has once again been condemned before anyone has established which actions were actually hers. Anne sees the coverage and feels her anger deepen. A major London morning paper runs the words, "She went too far," across its front page beside coverage of her arrival at a royal engagement, while a television broadcaster describes the crisis as the family's most personal rupture since Harry's departure. The princess hates the suggestion that her confrontation came from personal hostility. In her mind, she demanded evidence because confidential material appeared to be moving beyond legitimate boundaries. Meghan watches the coverage beside Harry and realizes the cost may survive whatever the investigation eventually proves. Even partial vindication cannot erase the image now fixed in public imagination. Her sitting before senior royals while being accused of plotting against them. Harry understands that pain, but he also knows the unanswered questions remain real. Their marriage may survive the omission, yet public memory is far less forgiving. Then the internal review produces the breakthrough nobody expected. Investigators identify a former palace-linked advisor who privately supplied contact information and encouraged broader requests, while failing to tell either side how far the search had expanded. The advisor had become a bridge between outside attempts to corroborate disputed events and internal sources capable of reaching archived communications. The evidence complicates everything. Meghan had authorized outreach seeking corroborating records, but the advisor pushed the effort further toward obtaining archived material. Responsibility now appears shared, but not equal. She was not entirely outside the chain, yet neither had she personally directed every step Anne originally feared. Charles reads the findings and summons everyone back. The king is ready to separate intention from escalation, mistake from betrayal, and suspicion from proof. The court had begun with one accusation against Meghan. It would end with a verdict that forced every person in the room to accept a different piece of the blame. When the family gathers again, there is no shouting left. Anne has made her accusation. Meghan has defended herself. Harry has admitted what he did and did not know. William has challenged the palace's assumptions, and Charles now possesses enough information to separate suspicion from responsibility. The final conclusion is uncomfortable for everyone. Meghan crossed a serious boundary by authorizing a secret effort to reconstruct private royal disputes, but she did not create every action carried out in her name. Charles delivers the finding without drama. Meghan had approved discreet outreach intended to gather supporting accounts and identify records connected to disputed royal events, but she had failed to control how aggressively intermediaries pursued confidential material. The king also confirms that a palace-linked advisor escalated those requests and enabled access through informal channels. That advisor is permanently removed from any royal-facing role, meaning they will no longer hold a position involving official family business or access. Anne does not apologize for confronting Meghan. The princess still believes the collection effort had to be exposed because private correspondence had been placed at risk. But she acknowledges something equally important. Her original belief that Meghan personally directed every stage went further than the evidence ultimately proved. That admission costs her pride, yet it also gives the final judgment credibility. She had demanded accountability, and now she accepts that accountability must apply to assumptions as well. Meghan turns to Harry and admits that secrecy created the conditions for mistrust. She says she should have told him exactly what she authorized, especially once intermediaries began moving beyond simple recollections. He listens without rescuing her from the consequences. Harry makes clear that he will not defend actions hidden from him, but he also refuses to let his wife carry responsibility for independent decisions made by others. For once, his loyalty is neither automatic rebellion nor automatic defense. William supports stronger protection for royal correspondence, but rejects collective punishment. The prince says wrongdoing must be attached to the person who committed it, not expanded until everyone becomes guilty by association. Harry hears the distinction, and something between the brothers finally shifts. It is not reconciliation. Not yet. But after years of suspicion, it is the first moment in which both men appear more interested in accuracy than victory. Charles closes the matter with one final principle. Grievance does not justify secretly collecting protected family material, but the monarchy cannot preserve trust by assigning convenient blame either. Anne was right to force the issue into the open. Meghan was wrong to allow a secret outreach effort to expand beyond her control. The advisor was wrong to push it further. And the palace was wrong to assume one villain could explain everything. Anne looks across the table at Meghan once more. There is no warmth, but there is no performance either. Meghan gives a restrained nod. Harry exhales. William lowers his eyes. Charles closes the folder and leaves it closed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.